Mindy,
So,
I'm so glad to be with you today as we talk about one of the paths to healing and wholeness after abortion. And today we're going to talk about the path of reframing your life.
mm,
So, before we dig into that, would you give our viewers some idea about your experience with abortion?
well, um, I have chosen abortion for three of my children. I have one child living, and she's grown to an adult. She's beautiful. But those three children I chose abortion for, and those were all the children I was going to have. Um, my experience with abortion, just in a nutshell, was fear, a lot of selfish kinds of fear. I I didn't have a capacity and ability to make good decisions at that time in my life. I was just living my life day to day and didn't think about the future, didn't
Mhm.
think about how the results, didn't think about consequences to anything. Was just trying to find a safe and secure place for myself, and in so doing, made a lot of really poor choices. And abortion became three of those choices, and it just led a lot of destructive behaviors magnified in my life after that. And there was just kind of this wake after abortion that led me into a dark place.
Mhm. Yeah, I can certainly relate to that, also having experienced three abortions. And I think one of the challenges is we can look back at that time in our life and the time leading up to that, and it's almost a little bit like a snapshot. And if we want to heal from abortion, that process involves looking at the bigger picture
Hmm.
and under looking at that picture with a fresh perspective.
Hmm.
Also seeing that there probably was more happening than we might have realized at the time with
Hmm.
ourselves, with our relationships, and so forth. So this path of reframing the past
Hmm.
isn't about excusing, or it isn't about denying what we did
Hmm.
with abortion. It's about understanding that there were a lot of different factors at work and understanding the pressures and the circumstances that led us to a place of an unplanned pregnancy and also to making the choice of abortion. So I wondered if you could talk about how, um, at the time of your abortions, what was your view of abortion? Like, was it a natural, like, of course I'm going to do this? Or how did you think about it? And what was your thought process?
I have wondered that so many times. There's some things I know and some things I don't know. Abortion wasn't in topic the way it is today.
Mm,
Abortion wasn't in the news the way it isn't today is today. It wasn't accepted the way it is today. So um, I'm pretty certain I never believed it was a clump of cells. My mother was a NICU nurse in Denver, and I visited her often. And so I would see these little babies that were 6 months old and fit in the palm of your hand, and then they would grow and thrive and become, very productive human beings. I knew what pregnancy was. I knew the truth. I just chose to not believe the truth
mm,
because my well being, my security, my safety, which was ultimately being threatened by this child, which now I can look back. You talk about looking back. Looking back is you could see things clearer than when you're in it. Oftentimes, hindsight is 2020, they say. And so, the art of going back and looking back isn't about. You talked about a couple of different things. We're not trying to go into denial and all this, but we're also not trying to become self-debasing either. We're not trying to revel in the pain either. What we're trying to do is get an accurate perspective and look at it, what we did, but through the lens of scripture, because we can't do this in and of ourselves by ourselves either, through human beings, because we have all kinds of crazy thoughts in our head, and they're not all true just because of what we think. So reframing is important, but is important biblically,
yeah.
to do it biblically, because
And many of my viewers are um, may not be Christian. They may not have any faith tradition. They may have never opened the Bible. And
Mhm.
so their frame of reference may be what they read in the news.
Yeah.
or what friends have done and said, or as you pointed out, it's the pressures of the moment.
Hmm.
I just remember feeling so afraid
Yes.
and so overwhelmed
Yes.
that I was a practicing Catholic. I knew the Bible somewhat, but I just froze.
Right.
Um, and so being able to step back and look now, seeing me frozen and seeing that there was much more than my fear.
I think you bring up such a good point, because in the moment that fear feels like I visualize things a lot, and so in the moment I'll go back and I'll kind of get myself back in that moment just so I can understand where I was. But in the moment, it feels like fear is just this dense forest, miles and miles long, that has no clear path through, and so you don't want to tackle it. You fear what's in there. You don't know what's going to get you. You don't know what you're up against. But when hindsight comes and you turn around and you've lived your life a little bit, maybe you've had a child or two, or you've gone through some things, and you look back and you go, you know what, I was really stronger than I thought. And that forest, if you will, of fear was not as thick as I thought it was. It was really very shallow.
Mm-hmm.
But from my perspective,
Mm-hmm.
fear clouded it and gave me a wrong judgment. So fear is I think, a very good emotion that God gave us, obviously, right? When we're in front of an alligator, I hope we run.
Yeah.
Or if a dog is
Yeah.
starting to attack us, I hope we hide somewhere. So
Yeah.
fear is very valid, but we have to understand fear in terms of our, what's happening with us. And really the child is nothing to fear.
Yeah.
You know?
And I think another important part of looking backwards is to look at all the influences. I mean, fear was a huge one, but I didn't wake up one day pregnant and deciding to have an abortion. There were circumstances, situations, and people that contributed to that. And we're going to talk about another path, building right relationships, in another video. What's important, I think, to say here is that we didn't come to that situation or that moment alone. And so when I think about making that choice, how was I prepared as a young woman for the consequences of a pregnancy and what I would do after that? I had no guidance from my parents. They never talked about anything like that. And it wasn't that I was stupid. I mean, I was in my 20s and even early 30s with my abortions. But that guidance was missing. And also that desperate need for attention from men,
Oh,
which
yeah.
took me into relationships that
Yeah.
led
You're
to.
speaking my story.
Am I?
You're totally speaking my story. I mean, I didn't have guidance from my parents either, and I'm not blaming them. They were doing the best that they could with what they had. But you said how you asked the question of yourself, how was I prepared for the consequences of pregnancy? And as I was sitting there listening to him, I was like, I wasn't at all. I was in total denial. This is not going to happen to me. I'm not going to get pregnant. And I wasn't even doing anything to keep that from happening. I wasn't even trying to. I was just total denial. And I didn't have the structure of, because I also was looking for love, so I would say to people, abortion doesn't come by itself. We don't just wake up pregnant and, oh, okay. We usually aren't thinking, well, back then we weren't thinking about abortion and as any kind of a solution, if you will, or any kind of a go-to. It was just pretty much off the radar. Today, it's probably more so on the radar, but because it's so much more accessible, but, it was more of an act of denial. And so there's a lot of things, even back in our childhood, that lead us on a road to abortion, because it's how our sort of the mindset of how we view ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
We view ourselves oftentimes through the lens of what others say or what others have done to us, or maybe even the awful things that we've done. Because I'll tell you, after abortion, changed the lens of how I thought about myself completely. And since I was the one that did it, and then I was the one that thought about it, I couldn't be the one to change it. See what I mean? Like I had to have something higher than me, greater than me, step into my life and help me reframe who I am, not based on who I think I am or what I did, My identity is not in my choices.
Yeah.
My identity is who in Jesus says I am. So that's where, ultimate reframing comes from.
Yeah. Yeah. And I can't help but mention the millions of women, and you and I have worked with some of them who uh, were uh, were bullied into, forced into having an
Yes.
abortion.
Yes.
Uh, the younger you are, parents who said you can't come home if you have this baby.
Right.
Um, Boyfriends or husbands who threatened or actually did physical harm.
Hmm.
So those are all factors
Yeah.
and the influence so that we can understand what was, a more clear and more complete picture of what was going on. Again, not to excuse ourselves, but
No.
to see that it is more complicated
Well,
than
and
we might have first thought.
that helps with later on in the healing process when we need to forgive. And so you're talking about the direct influence that was in our life, but there's indirect influence in our life. Like I couldn't go to my mom because I was afraid she would think bad of me.
Hmm.
Well, whether she would have or not, she wouldn't have stopped loving me. I mean, the reality is, if she would have remained my mom, I know there are some moms that are awful that would, say, "I will never talk to you again," and threaten your children. But just that indirect pressure or indirect influence in your life that kind of steers and moves you in a direction because of, again, fear. It's all fear. It's all
Hmm.
fear based. And so, yeah. So I guess what I was getting at also is that when we go back to look at those things, what it helps us do is untangle those thoughts that we've stuffed
Mm.
away or just wrapped up and confused with other things. And it helps us to pull those out and pull those apart and go, okay, this person influenced me in this way. I mean, at the end of the day, it's our choice. I
Mhm.
don't think the majority of us were ever strapped down or forced to take pills. At the end of the day, we did it, but it helps us to put them in the right place that they were, whatever their influence, and then properly be able to go, okay, now I can forgive them, or now I can work towards forgiving them. And so it's that work towards that healing, because that's part of our healing journey is the forgiveness part.
Mhm.
You know.
And would you say, even as it's been a few years for you and a few years for me, that perspective of that time in your life continues to evolve? Or is it like okay, now I've got this expanded, like a new snapshot that's wider, but it's stuck? Or would you say that it continues to uh, deepen or have nuance and expand?
I would say maybe yes and no. I think in the first years of healing and walking through that, and then getting into serving others, which increases that healing because you're at a different level now, and you're having to tell others what the truth that you've learned is about God and about what God thinks about these things. That takes you to a different level because it's like, well, if I don't believe it, I can't say it. So in all of those years, the new to healing, and then because these are our children, and so we heal in layers,
Mhm.
right? We were automatically governed by milestones and events and calendars and seasons and birth dates, specific years that are like 16 and 21, and these years that we tend to celebrate. And so there's different eras of our life that we might think differently about those children. And like when I turned 50, my abortions were early in my 20s. And when I turned into my 50s, all of a sudden I started thinking about the grandchildren I'll never meet,
Yeah.
the spouses I'll never meet, and the friends of those kids that I'll never meet. And I started to have like a somberness of spirit. And I really didn't understand at first. I wasn't even, it's kind of like running in the background in my mind. So I wasn't fully aware.
Mhm. Mhm.
And then all of a sudden it hit me, oh my gosh, I'm going through another layer of grieving. And I'm going to embrace this because I know this isn't going to destroy me. This is healthy, and this is normal. This should be
Mhm.
a normal process of
Mhm.
grieving. So
Yeah.
I just went through it, and I don't even remember getting to the other side. I was fine because I had the tools at that time, but shaping my perspective, seeing it, is it ongoing? I think after a while, um, I would say you pretty much have the understanding that you have towards what you
Mhm.
did,
Mhm.
you know. But there is a time where you're still processing, and everybody processes at different rates and at different ways. And, and then there might be that layer of healing that comes. Like when my husband and I got married, we couldn't have children. I had to grieve the loss of that because I had all the children I was going to have, and I made the choices for them that I made, and that was the end. And that by the time I wanted them in that sense, because I was actually married and in a relationship that was loving and, lifetime, now I couldn't have any. And so I did have to go through that layer of healing as well, which did affect my perspective of myself. And I had to work through all of that and the abortions and that kind of thing. So.
Mhm. Yeah, and I don't want to mislead or to direct people to let's just keep churning in our pain.
Right.
Because
Right.
that is more of a ploy of the enemy, of Satan, who wants to
Absolutely.
keep us revisiting the past and rewashing the clean laundry,
Yes. Yes.
because we can just keep beating ourselves up.
Well, and it's not healthy. I don't think that's what God wants. To live an abundant life, we don't stay sitting in our past. But I think the point of going back there to identify who we need to forgive, identify how God views that sin, and actually give it to Him,
Hmm.
properly grieve if we need to, is
Yeah.
all healthy. And then, like I tell the ladies, because we do like, healing layers, I tell ladies, if you go through a healing group, revel in that,
Yeah.
enjoy that space of healing. If you get triggered later on, and then you get triggered again, or something happens and you're like, oh my gosh, why is this bothering me now? Well, maybe you address that, but you don't need to go all the way back necessarily, but address
Mhm.
that. And in context of all of that, and then just keep moving forward, like I did. So when I was 50 and the thought of my grandchildren came up, I didn't go all the way back to everything else and start over. I was like,
Uh,
oh, okay, I get it. I'm just gonna let my body grieve. My body was taking me where my head didn't understand, and so I was just letting my body go through that natural grieving process, that natural understanding, and then I just moved on, with grace, and just giving that back to the Lord.
mm. Thank you for your wisdom. And I just encourage my viewers to follow us up to the next path together. Grieve and forgive.